of colonization, and despite all, sort of predictions, we're still here. But that shouldn't take away from the fact that for centuries, we have not had the opportunities to enter into spaces where we are able to have self-determining decision-making powers over our lands and territories, and that has been imposed on us through colonial structures. Now, I can appreciate the fact that as we are coming and butting up against the fact that, economic growth and the sort of models of infinite growth that we have predicated our entire economic structures on is finally having this moment of actualization of, oh shit, we can't do this anymore. And that we're creating these models where we're reevaluating and creating different metrics and value systems to determine how we can move forward. But the challenge is it's still being done within the confines and the structures of colonial frameworks. So how do we start to bend and move those lines, not just to include all of the great stuff that was included in the first presentation and the first graphs, because all those things are valid. We're not trying to take away from, but trying to expand the value systems and the perspectives in how we determine what is happiness, what is, wellness and well-being for our communities. And we have to recognize that colonization isn't something that happened, it's still happening today. My people, I come from the Treaty 8 territory in northern Alberta. We are downstream from the largest industrial project on planet Earth. Can anyone take a stab at what that is? Pardon me? Tar sands. So I know what the concept of infinite growth looks like in actuality, and I can tell you that it has not served our people. We were told at the beginning of this development that it would bring prosperity and well-being and happiness to our community. But what it has done is it has created a system in where we are forced to make a decision between what is considered economic well-being within the frameworks of a colonial ideology versus our own traditional indigenous values and ideologies. We are forced to make those decisions. And when we do not actively participate, we are forced and coerced into participating in economic systems that we had no hand in creating. And so I'm really happy to see, economists butting up against this really big challenge, because it offers an avenue for indigenous cosmologies, perspectives, and values to be integrated into what this new future looks like. I don't want us to get stuck on this idea that we're looking to the past as the solutions, this utopian past that has all the answers. And again, thank Deborah for being we didn't have it right. We didn't have it perfect, but we had some things better than what they're currently at right now. So what does the future look like? What do, changing economies look like in this sort of global crisis world that we're in? We're faced by this global crisis of climate change, but it is just adding insult to injury to the existing traumas of indigenous peoples where we're becoming reactionary. So we need to have and allow for those moments for indigenous peoples to see themselves as a part of these new economies. And that means that we have to create those spaces and avenues for people to do that. And I'm going to give my own personal experience recently. Who's heard of the Green New Deal? Who's heard of the difference? Who knows the difference between Green New Deal in Canada versus Green New Deal in the US? Not too many. Okay, so I'll start there then. So the Green New Deal in the US was, the reason it's called the Green New Deal is the New Deal was created sort of post-recession in the US, sort of dirty 30s. They were we got to figure out what to do. Our economy is dying. Our people are unhappy. We need some sort of new stimulus plan. We're going to create the New Deal, where we're going to create this new economic stimulus, jobs for everybody, and blah, 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 blah. Kind of what we're talking about in SDG number 8. But it wasn't focused on sustainability. It was just focused on everybody having access to employment, except for when it was created, everybody didn't include Black people, Indigenous people, or anyone of color for that matter. And it was really predicated on this structure of colonial powers maintaining colonial power and white supremacy. So now we have the Green New Deal. Obviously, it's much more expansive and robust, but it was created on this idea that we are simultaneously dealing with an economic crisis and a climate crisis, and that we're trying to find ways to equalize the two and create, this whole idea of the, for the SDG number 8, more peaceful and prosperous world by 2030, and building sustainable economic growth, ensuring decent work for all. That's really the foundations of the Green New Deal. But we're being faced with the reality that this can't happen in the current structures. We cannot maintain the status quo. So, enter into Canada's Green New Deal as we're trying to have this conversation here in this country with the largest industrial project on planet Earth that still wants to grow. We think that in this time of the climate crisis that you would see this industry looking at, maybe a cap, maybe a moratorium on expansions, looking at ways to equalize and distribute economic and sustainable economic growth, but in actuality, we're still talking about expanding. In fact, there will be a decision at the end of next month looking at approving the largest ever proposed tar sands project, the Teck Resources Frontier Mine. Did I not mention that colonization is still happening? The Frontier Mine. Sometimes I'm just totally WTF, what is happening? So we are still talking about creating growth, and we're still pushing these coercive measures on Indigenous communities to accept these economic sectors and drivers as the drivers that are going to give us well-being, health, and happiness. But in actuality, what it has contributed to is pushing us away from our traditional lifestyles, which have now been recognized the world over that Indigenous lifestyles and lifeways model some of the most low-carbon and sustainable lifestyles on the planet, which is why 80% of the world's biodiversity is found within Indigenous territories. So we're told, abandon that because you're going to have money, and money will give you well-being. I'm so happy that we are recognizing that is not the case. All of our presenters have said that economic growth does not equate happiness or well-being, and in fact can lead to the opposite. Tar sands, case in point. So, how do we move forward from here? When we talk about developing sustainable economic growth, we absolutely have to consider Indigenous values, lifestyles, and lifeways as part of the guiding principles. And that if we are actually talking about a more prosperous and peaceful world by 2030, as the SDG goals state, then we have to look at how we imagine this prosperous future. What is this prosperous future? Are we going to look at the original New Deal, that the prosperous future was only for one segment of the population? Or are we going to talk about a prosperous future that includes the value systems of multiple people? Currently, that conversation is very difficult. I have been a part of developing the Green New Deal in Canada and the language around it, and I was not met with open arms when I stated that we needed to include very specific language around the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, including free, prior, and informed consent. Because there was fear that if we included such radical language, I don't understand, that we would be supporting one stakeholder over another. I want to point out that we have fundamental rights in this country as Indigenous peoples. We are supposed to be given and granted our ability to have sovereignty and autonomy over ourselves. And yet when we ask for the actualization of that, not just by our governments, but by the current public, and even within the environmental movements, we are met with resistance and reticence to accept that as a status quo. So we need to be talking about developing just transition models that are going to break this cycle of, state leaders and colonial governments determining the routes forward in which we must go, determining what sustainable economic growth looks like, and we must expand these notions to accept and integrate Indigenous cosmologies, value systems into developing what sustainable economic growth or non-growth looks like. So there's a lot of different organizations doing some great work. I wanted to plug this. The Indigenous Environmental Network has created the Indigenous Principles of Just Transition. It's not just, if you order it from them, you don't just get the principles, but you also get a really pretty poster. So you can look at the poster and flip it over and read all about it. But the idea is that we are our own experts. Indigenous peoples have been living in harmony with our natural ecosystems for generations, for millennia. And this comes from this intrinsic relationships that we have with the natural world, which guided everything from our languages. The evolution of our languages is driven from the land, from our food systems to our economies. And that is where the sort of science is telling us the direction we need to go, is we need to find ways to create economies that work in harmony with nature and the natural world. And who better to look to as experts than Indigenous communities? I had this really great conversation in the quad, I don't know what you want to call that thing in the middle right out there, the little center today, around stories that I heard. And experiences around Indigenous relationships with nature. And I started by talking about the transmission of information by the Waroni people in Ecuador, which I was just privy to go down to that community, where they were telling stories about how they transmit their knowledge, or not just knowledge, but just information that's vital, from one community to the next via the trees and the jaguar. And they have an intimate relationship with these species, and they can transmit a message from one community to another, which might take them 1 to 2 days. And so there have been anthropologists that have seen what they cannot describe as even functionally possible, the transmission of simple information from one community to another over a time span that seems impossible. And I think about how that relates to my own experiences, because I've lived these things. As Indigenous peoples, we have these different relationships to the natural world, which have guided so much of our relationships and have guided the principles and the values in which we create all of our structures of governance, that is intrinsically connected to our relationships with the natural world. I'm going to end with this one little story. When I was about 5 or 6 years old, I really wanted to pick peppermint. I was like, I want to go pick some mint leaves. I'm going to go pick some mint leaves. And I went down. I was trying to find them. Couldn't find them. And my mom said, you need to talk to the mint leaves, and you need to ask them for permission to pick them. So I sat down by the water, and I made an offering, and I talked to the mint leaves. I was by myself. And when I looked up and opened my eyes, I was literally sitting in a patch of mint that I could not see until I had the moment to speak to those plants. So this is the type of knowledge that we bring forward and into the discussions that could fundamentally shift and change the discourse on how we talk about growth. Thank you, Masi Cho. We just go in this way. I'm going to sit here.
Doesn't matter.
I think it was like this. I don't know.
Oh, there we go. We have a system.
Ooh. Yeah, it doesn't matter where you sit, like near us.
Yeah.
Good.
So we've talked for too long.
Oh, well.
It's 9 minutes past 8.
Ooh.
And the aim here is to get over to the questions from the general audience. But I'm going to ask a very simple question. And I am not an academic. I work with environmental organizations, I work on campaigns, and I'm interested in what Canadians know and think about environmental issues. And I've heard Peter talk about the decoupling of happiness from GDP. I've heard Leah talk about the global harms done by a capitalist economy that's predicated on growth. Deborah, you've talked about the need to decolonize the language of the SDGs. And Ariel, you have spoken about the profound need to bring the discussion of new models into a conversation with Indigenous communities. These are, to my mind, hugely complicated challenges for a country that is only just broaching a conversation about truth and reconciliation at the same time as a climate crisis and a broader environmental crisis is facing us. Is this challenge just out of reach? You've got 30 seconds.
No. There's my answer. No, I don't think it is. I think we're having it. And I think that we're going to be continued to be forced into these conversations because of where we are at in truth and reconciliation, and because where we're at within the conversation around climate change and the conversations around economies. There's just no way around it.
Others, any want to add to that, or?
I mean, I think that if we can't do it, who can? I mean, as I said in my talk, we're one of the wealthiest countries in the world. You see countries, I mean, of course, we've had, seen the fall of apartheid. You've seen countries completely, there's been other countries that have done really tremendous things in terms of actually putting in place just transition. If you look, Spain has closed down its coal mining industry and actually come up with alternatives for those workers. So we have a tremendous amount of resources available. So I don't think really these challenges are out of reach in the way that you say.
I think that there's always hope. I think for Anishinaabe anyway, part of our central way of thinking principles is always hope. And we ask for strength to be able to make the changes that we do. But I think also, and I think about one of my favorite stories, I'm not going to have time to tell it, is the Pipe and the Eagle story. So in that story, there's a whole bunch of things to learn from it, but one of them is humans kind of have to get over ourselves, and we're not that good at that. Humans are hugely arrogant. We think we're at the top of the food chain, even though people say that we're not, but really that's so embedded in how in the world economic order, the global order, but in this story, humans we're really smart, really intelligent, but hugely destructive because we can make choices. We can make choices of well-being. We can make choices of being destructive and greedy and all those kind of things. But we can also be so beautifully creative and innovative, and we really haven't probably done that enough. And part of that is letting go of the fact that we think we're the smartest, and then listening to see the other stories that are coming from the earth itself. And we have stories that tell us that. How are the other beings living up to their responsibilities? Because we're the ones that actually aren't. Everything else is trying to, except for us. So I think it's possible if we learn to listen to different kind of stories, to other entities other than people, because we need to get over the fact that we're incredibly destructive and that we're actually not at the top of the food chain, that we're not. So and that's probably maybe going in a different direction, but the question, that's what it made me think of. We always had this hope that it's going to be possible to do that, but if we let go of the fact that we have all the answers and maybe we need to look in different places for them, then maybe I think we can head in different kind of directions, because knowledge isn't just held by people, it's held in other places. So hopefully that wasn't too freaky, but that's what it made me think.
No, it made me think about Ariel talking to the mint. We need to listen in different places and different ways. Peter, you've been very quiet so far, so I'm going to put a question to you.
You're the token male here.
And
What about him?
what about me?
He's
Exactly,
not a
yeah.
presenter.
On the panel, he's trying to manage us.
Do we have questions from the floor, by the way?
But no, you should answer this.
Okay, so I could ask
gotta ask
another
a different
question. I'm going to go over to the audience now.
Well, that's a novel.
SDG 8 talks about full productive employment and decent work, but there is now evidence that technology, AI, robots are displacing routine work.
Automation.
If this is true, what can be done to ensure people have meaningful and well-paid job opportunities in the coming decades?
Okay, Peter.
I feel
Peter,
like
I think that's your question.
it's a perfect
Well-
question for him.
There's quite an interesting debate about the implications for new technology on employment. I mean, after all, we've lived through a century or more of new technology, and unemployment somehow has magically stayed up. That has something to do with the lessons learned from the New Deal and so on. Spend money and you can create employment. so that concern has been there for a long time, and it goes back. I mean, one thinks of John Maynard Keynes talking about the economic possibilities for our grandchildren. What would we do with only having to work 15 hours a week because machines? So we've had quite a lot of experience, and the projections to this point have largely been wrong. Now, why is it different now? Because we're dealing with very different kinds of technologies that can displace different kinds of work. I would say two things. One is a basic income's not enough. We need basic wealth. In other words, a key question is who's going to own this technology if it's going to have the kind of adverse effects you're talking about. Because if they're owned in a fairly
what happened to
general way, shared way, then we'll get the dividends. The second thing is
Your sound is
Your
off.
mic,
No one can hear you.
Is your
your
sound?
mic came off.
Did it
Can
undo?
Can people hear Peter at the back?
No. Check your line.
Where is it?
No. I think it's your line. Check your line, like your box.
Maybe it became
You have your box.
I'm out of the conversation.
Okay. Do we have
Technical
a microphone
support.
somewhere?
No more token mail.
You can do that because you're saying important stuff, but nobody
Yeah,
can hear
go
you.
to the podium. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's still
By
not
the way,
working.
whose book
No.
is outside. And I have written a paper on the productivity trap where we make the argument that it's not out of the question that a lot of the work that will have to be done with respect to having, let's say, an aging population is in the caring professions. There's also, when one thinks of entertainment, either self-made or whatever, there are real limits to the extent to which technology can take over. The example he loves to point to is, do you want to hear Beethoven's Fifth played twice as fast because that would be more efficient? Of course not. It would save time, be a different event. So there really are competing views about the technologies that we're likely to have to deal with and their impacts. So I would conclude with the following point. We shouldn't just let technology be imposed upon us. We have to, and we've had some experience in this, bring back things like technology assessment so that we can more consciously talk about what technologies we want and at what pace we want to introduce them. And I'm quite happy to be saying that in this setting here because we know where some of the funding came from, a company that was really pushing the envelope for a while on technology. And not that was necessarily a bad thing, but who was in control? Who was thinking about it? And so that's the first thing. And the second thing, what I've already said, is the question of ownership. We're not paying any attention to that. We're just seeing enormous concentration of wealth in a few hands arising from the introduction of technologies that we're not really being able to control. So we do have some work to do there, and I think some of the ideas from my fellow panelists actually have really sparked some ideas from me that I'll have to think about. Just new ways of thinking about all this.
Microphone. You can come sit.
Peter, you can come back here now.
Can I add
Something
can I add something, just like thinking about the hands of certain people controlling everything. Like, this is some of my concern when we start talking about things like Goal 8 and the Green New Deal, which are pretty much in line, is that who's determining, who's creating these green new economies, who's creating these new job sources that are being created? Because if we don't address the fundamental inequalities that exist, that Leah really pointed out, then we're still going to just end up with these very disparities will still continue to rise. And it's something like we live in a corporatocracy. When you talked about El Dorado, I just need to name this. El Dorado is the same mining company that forcibly removed my family off of our traditional territory in 1979. They removed us for uranium development in northern Saskatchewan. And so you look at there's a small handful of companies that are committing these atrocities globally, and they're the same ones that are going to sort of appropriate these new emerging economies if we don't address that.
Yeah, and just one other point about this kind of the coming of the robots. I think actually, we can think of this as an opportunity for what is needed, which is a much broader reconceptualization of what work is. And we only think about, okay, we're not going to have jobs anymore. A colleague of mine, he talks about, well, instead of, are these, how we've kind of moved from livelihoods to deathlihoods, and how we can begin to rethink work itself. So you were saying, Peter was saying that, of course, one of the biggest growing sectors is the care industry, and there's a lot of work already happening within caring, some of it paid, most of it, almost all of it unpaid. And I would just like to bring up one other example of kind of rethinking work, which was the feminist demand of wages for housework, when they were saying, well, we need to be paid for all the work we do in the house, including actually, sex. Everything should be paid. And what was the point of this demand? Saying, would they actually want to be paid for having sex with their husbands? But actually, the demand was supposed to be an impossible demand, that they said that if women were actually paid for this reproductive work that they did, it would actually, the capitalist system would collapse. And I think that's sort of along the ways that we need to be thinking. And when we make demands, when we say pay the climate debt, when we make demands saying pay the ecological debt, at least from my perspective, when it's not about actually, well, yeah, of course we would probably take the money, but it's really the underlying thing is that this would threaten the system, because the system cannot operate without these being able to expropriate these free this free labor of women in nature.
Yeah.
I cross my legs then. Kai asks, and this kind of picks up on what you were saying, Peter, just a moment ago, how can we find ways to make giving back to sustain our planet and each other a core part of how we understand the future economy? How do we make this more attractive than economic growth? And I'm just going to throw in one other aspect of that question. What you've described so far is profoundly troubling to the interests that exist right now.
Yeah.
So we need to make this attractive, more attractive than economic growth, and the whole world is against us. How are we going to do it?
Okay, so the last but one slide I showed was an attempt to show that there are more attractive options for us than economic growth. That's the whole point of that approach to contributing to this very broad discussion. We have to talk more about the alternative. Somebody already quoted the Tina principle, which I think is, there is no alternative. That's such a mind-crushing slogan. There are lots of alternatives, lots of choices to be made, and I don't think it's that hard to show, as I've tried to do, that alternatives not predicated on the pursuit of economic growth can lead to much better lives for most people than they would otherwise have, and certainly for other species. So it's a question of storytelling. Now, economists, and I'm guilty of this myself, we're not very good storytellers. Yet others on this panel are way more expert on that than I am. And so this is one of the reaching across that has to be done, that the sort of analytical work that I try to do as an ecological economist needs to find other voices to express what it is we're trying to say, because they can do it much better than us. In terms of making it more attractive, you can't make it more attractive to everybody, because a part of a better future is a more egalitarian one. And some people are going to have to give up something. But we're living in this era, as is quite well known, of extraordinary inequality in the distribution of income and wealth. And it's just getting more and more skewed. And so that has to be turned around, and that can be done. But it has to be done through the political system that we have, and it has to be done through political parties raising this as an issue. And how are they going to do that? Well, they need people like us to bring it to their attention, say, we really want action on that, and then maybe we'll see something.
Yeah. I have a question then. Like, you both talked about how like economic growth does not equate happiness and wellness and well-being, right? We have graphs now to prove that as GDP increases, happiness doesn't. So how do we make that more commonplace? So I think about like in my own territory, our communities are faced with an option. Drive truck for the tar sands, dig up tar sands, make $100,000 a year. You can buy a quad, you can buy a snowmobile, you can buy all of these things, but you can't drink your water, and your culture is a part, you're participating in your own cultural genocide. And what I've seen as empowering for our communities is that when you give them alternatives that are not that, they might not be making $100,000 a year, but they're exponentially more happy. So I have a cousin that quit driving truck and is now running culture, like bringing young kids from high school onto the land. And he makes like way less money, but he's exponentially happier. And so how do we demonstrate that happiness doesn't come from wealth and, growing GDP? I don't know how we can create that as a common understanding.
There's so many, can I comment on this? So many dimensions to this. I just want to pick on a couple. One of the problems with the pursuit of GDP as an important policy objective is that it then becomes the criterion against which everything else gets judged.
Yeah.
So now, people in the arts, for example, can't just say that somehow exposure to the arts is beneficial. They have to say it'll do such and such to the local economy, or it'll raise local GDP. Or, I mean, it's an absurd way to have to defend the arts. So we have to dethrone GDP as a measure by which everything else is judged. And most economists understand this. One of the originators of GDP, whose name I've forgotten for the moment, has made it quite clear it should not be used as a measure of well-being. Yeah. And he said that to the US Senate in the 1930s. And so it's quite well known. So it's taken on this role by default. And one way of undermining that is to promote other metrics, I have to say that, which are more reasonable, more comprehensive, and that's kind of one of the things that's informed my work. But that's, again, part of storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to fire a number of audience questions fairly quickly, just because there are lots. I think we've got a fair number of questions. So try and, if it's possible to give a few words to each, and then we'll move on. Here's a tough one. We are trying to value or quantify in monetary units motherhood. So I have two questions. What are we going to try to be next, i.e., in our relationships as friends, elders, or any social interaction? Does that capture the gist of the question, whoever asked that? Do you want to clarify? Is that, yeah? Shall I repeat that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, we're trying to value or quantify in monetary units motherhood. So I have two questions. The first question is, what are we going to try to be next, i.e. in our relationships as friends, elders, or any interaction? Any social interaction. I should perhaps mention the second question. Does this help to contribute to capitalist values further?
What was the last part?
Does this help to contribute further to capitalism?
Oh,
so the system that underpins.
By quantifying these things?
We're trying to, beg your pardon?
Is it, that question is so abstract.
Okay, I'm going to move, unless you would, go ahead, yeah.
But I wouldn't
Okay,
mind saying
sure,
something
go.
about it.
Yeah.
Look, I happen to think that we've gone way too far in monetizing all sorts of things which are outside of the market economy.
Yeah.
And this is, I make this criticism quite often when I get a chance, that economists have done it way too much when it comes to what we call ecosystem services. They like to value them in dollar terms. As soon as you do that, you can't help but adopt a commodification perspective on the environment. And I think this is just taking us in exactly the wrong direction. The market economy, as it's called in its friendlier ways, has permeated so much of our social life. And we need to restrain it. We need to pull it back. And that will allow all sorts of other forms of social relationships to flourish in a way that they can't. And so I think, although it was a nice political point to value motherhood and aspects in dollar terms, but it was, as I think you said, was to make a point, not as a proposal, as the way we should be valuing all aspects of social life.
Deborah.
I guess my train of thinking in trying to understand the question, and I may have not have understood it, is like, who do we want to be? And I guess in my own tradition, I want to be a good ancestor. We should be good ancestors to descendants, because we're descendants. I have obligations as a descendant from my ancestors. We want to be good ancestors to the descendants. And that means all life, not just people. Again, because you always move outside of just people being the center of the whole universe, which hasn't worked out so well for the universe. So that's how I would answer that, and that's not something you can really quantify. So we're trained to be good ancestors, and we think about the future generations and who our descendants are going to be and what they need to be able to live a good life. So that's kind of what it kind of made me think. Free association somewhere out there. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Does the United Nations offer any models or guidance on if and how the SDG 8 goal can be achieved without being in conflict with other SDG goals that are environmentally focused? No.
No, I was going to say no.
I guess, yeah, no.
I think that's a no.
So I'm gonna ask a communications question. This discussion that we're having feels very grounded and sensible, and in many ways, just timely to speak to the problems we have. This is not a discussion we ever hear unfolding in any detail in the main public discourse in Canada right now. This is I would argue, a bit of a bubble of a conversation on the edge of an academic conference. How do you envisage bringing this into the mainstream of public debate in Canada in a way with sufficient speed that we're going to be able to engage Canadians in a genuine way and overcome the real fears that many are going to have confronted with such challenging ideas?
You decided to go there, did you? We had a little bit of a conversation at dinner about this. I think the reality is we're going to be forced into having this conversation, whether we like it or not. Climate change and the climate crisis and the economic crisis together is magnifying inequalities, is magnifying the disparities that we're seeing. It's magnifying the multitudes of human rights abuses across, and ecocide. Polly Higgins, who just passed away, really highlighting the rights of nature. And we're starting to be confronted with the limitations of these current structures, and they're going to force us into conversations that are not comfortable. And Peter talked about it. We're going to be forced to make compromises. We cannot maintain the status quo of business as usual. And that isn't just economic business, it's all business as usual. So I think that, we can either do it willingly or we can do it kicking and screaming and running away from forest fires and, floods. So it's going to be something that we're going to be forced with. So we have an opportunity to work together and build intersectional movements, or we're going to be forced into, a crisis mode that is going to push us further apart.
Leah.
So I think that, I just came from Europe recently, and there's also kind of been this tidal change as regards of where people are regarding climate change action. So, some months ago, we were marching in Montreal they're calling it like Fridays for Future, or the Student Climate March, almost 200,000 people marching in Montreal. In Europe, in several countries, they've now, the governments have actually declared climate emergencies. In the UK, it's being pushed in Spain. I'm personally actually not necessarily in favor of that approach because it opens potential doors, I think, to sort of potentially eco-fascist actions or the state kind of co-opting it to use it in different ways. This is perhaps another conversation we won't get into now. But when that does happen, when you kind of admit that this is an emergency, I think you can make space for saying, what are these type of, what is the serious actions that we really need to take now? What are the sort of conversations that really need to happen? And just one other point, I think, that's kind of relates back to the thing you say about what are we offering people? And I think for me, this has to do with the feeling that people have when they get involved with this mass mobilization, that, you know, like, go to a protest and you begin to break down these feelings of alienation that people experience every day and I think that it constrains action. And I think this capacity of feeling, oh, we can achieve things collectively, we can socially mobilize and do things in our community, is also at the same time as like the force for change to happen, can also become something that is motivating people to say, well, there's other things beyond economic growth. So it's that breaking down of alienation. So I think there is a lot of possibilities. And then when you look at students today, I mean, it's not a fringe thing for them. They're all, a lot of them are involved. So that's kind of the hopeful aspects.
That's the hopeful piece. Deborah, did you want to comment on that?
My comment was just gonna relate to, in the Canadian context anyway, I think in some ways that conversation does happen, but maybe not the way you described it, through essentially Indigenous peoples resisting, you know, the industrial development, whatever that kind of looks like. It's not framed that way, but they're the ones who say, bad idea, look what happens. And it's just whether people, in my view, are actually ready to kind of process and deal with that. And a lot of people aren't. Like as you said, they don't want to, it means you have to give up some things and like privilege. And people don't want to do that. So I think Indigenous peoples are putting it there. Like maybe 30 years ago you didn't see it so much, but I would say in the last decade a lot more. So they're showing that. They're showing the ugliness of what all that means, but also the possibilities of where you can go in terms of the alternatives. I think people generally aren't really ready for that kind of message. So it becomes very polarized. That's like an Indigenous issue. Like, who cares? There's only 4% and can't, whatever, right? People don't know how to, like, but it's kind of our lands, like all of it, right? I didn't bring those maps, so it's like affecting everybody. And people, a lot of the leaders and activists are doing it for everybody. Like everybody benefits from what a few people are taking very high risks to do. So I do think it's actually there, but the narrative is actually a different one and not framed in the way that you did. But it is there, and I think it's usually Indigenous peoples who are out there taking the hits in terms of how it's playing out, like in public policy, like in dialogue and everything else. So that's sort of my thinking on that.
So it's now 20 to 9, and we were going to go off for drinks if the questions began to get boring, but they're not, so we're going to keep you here for a while longer. And we're getting down to the real nitty-gritty. So listen to this. I currently work at a corporation in an office job. What should I do?
I don't know. Burn it down from the inside. No, I don't know. I am not.
You know, I'm often asked that question, or some question of that sort. I think that it's our responsibility to speak up whenever we have an opportunity to do so. Now, sometimes that can be very hard to do because you think, maybe quite rightly, you're taking an enormous personal risk for very little gain. But I think that's not part of living the good life. And some of my close friends now who are working in the civil service but were students of mine at one time, some of them here in the room, often ask me that, you know, because I used to work in government. They say, well, what are we supposed to say? They don't want to hear it. And I think the last thing you want to do is shut up. You know, you really do need if you've got an insight, and one that comes from ecological economics, which is absolutely fundamental, a defining characteristic of ecological economics is the view that the economy is not a sort of freestanding set of institutions, but it's actually embedded in the biosphere, which means it absorbs materials and energy from the biosphere, does things with them, and then dispose of that back into the biosphere as waste. And now, because the volumes of material and energy are getting so great, the damage to the biosphere is increasingly obvious. Now, ecological economists understand this fundamentally. Most people trained in standard economics do not, because they don't start from that pre-analytic, if you like, perspective. Well, it's important then to keep bringing that forward. Whenever you're in a discussion, if you're an economist, talking about whatever it is, the bank rate, you have to make that connection. If you change the bank rate, what's that going to do to incentives to mine and therefore to extract materials? It's not that hard to make these connections, and I really believe people have to speak up. Now, the person who's sitting in a desk working for a corporation didn't tell us what the corporation does. I mean, you always have the option of finding another desk in some other company. But, you know, again, whatever your capacity for action is, and to engender a conversation in your setting, you really need to push yourself to do it. Otherwise, you know, that black line I showed you of sort of downward despair is actually what we're going to see.
I think what I would add to that is live up to the treaty obligations. Like,
Yeah, that would be nice.
yeah, that would be kind of cool. So understanding what they are and what that means in terms of yourself as an individual benefiting from our lands, and probably the corporation is, and understanding what those obligations are, and try to have more reciprocal kind of relationships. Like, look around and go, are there Indigenous people here? And if they're not, how are they? Like, just look at equity, like you were saying. Like, so I think those things can be thought about, and those are things that an individual can think about and then try to influence others on. So that's kind of my bias.
I also want to tackle it from a little bit of a different angle, because I think when we think of someone's like, oh my God, I work for a corporation, maybe I should feel like really bad, and like, what should I do? How do I make the best of this? And you can do all the things you talked about, but also recognizing that, you know, it's not just the communities that are at the front lines of like these environmental justice movements, where we're not the only victims to capitalization or capitalism. The people that are forced into looking like maybe that's the only job you could find was working for a corporation. And that's because these models have dominated our systems, our economic systems, and we're left with very little choices outside of the capitalist system. So we are all victims to capitalism. And so what are you supposed to do? Well, you need to pay, like, unfortunately, if you live in a city, you probably have to pay rent or a mortgage, and you have to go to the grocery store. We don't live in a system where all those things are for free. So I wouldn't beat yourself up for working for a corporation, but you could actively be a part of discourses and conversations around what does it look like to respect treaty rights? What does it look like to share your information with those that are fighting capitalist models, so on and so forth. So don't beat yourself up because you're just working for the big bad guys, as long as you're actively trying to dismantle them from the inside, I guess.
And this one, what can I do to help spread ecological economics? Do people know what this means?
You have to read Peter's book.
Just promote
Do
Peter's
people
stuff.
know what this means?
Nobody
Ecological economics.
Nobody knows. No.
It's an emerging discourse that comes with various different perspectives and
So
definitions.
I have an answer to this question.
Sure.
And I'm interested in this because my ecological economics teacher, who I learned from about 2 months ago, I'm very new to this topic, by the way, so the answer to this is I've been working in the environmental movement for about 20 years, and I really couldn't define the difference between ecological economics and, say, environmental economics until about 2 months ago when Eric Miller explained it to me. So I think what needs to be done from a communications point of view, what can you do to help spread ecological economics? You can support organizations that are working on ecological economics, and there are NGO nonprofit groups, there are research groups and whatnot in Canada that are very much focused on this. DSF has a whole arm that is working on natural assets and working with municipalities to attach value to things like wetlands and ecosystems. So there's an educational piece that you can do there. More broadly, I think that there's stuff that can be done by ecological economists to help bring their ideas into the mainstream, and that might be along the lines of some kind of think tank nationally that is very good at just packaging ideas and getting them into the public discussion in ways that are much more efficient than what happens right now.
Or you could support Indigenous communities that have been modeling in ecological economics for millennia.
So, are there any more questions from the floor? Yep.
These must be the bad ones.
Sorry? Okay. It's 8:45. Does everybody want to go home now, or do you want another 5 minutes of questions? More? Okay, good. How do we have this conversation in a way that doesn't generate overwhelming fear, panic, paralysis, etc., and generates collaboration, creativity, and co-intelligence? Oh, also blame/shame game is in there. So how do we have this conversation without triggering overwhelming fear, panic, paralysis, etc., and in a way that generates collaboration, creativity, and co-intelligence?
I've never found that a problem. And I'll tell you why. Audiences generally self-select. So I would just hypothesize that most of the people who came to this evening's event found the views that were expressed fairly palatable. The problem is not how do you have the conversation so that it doesn't upset people. It's how do you have the conversation? How do you get a group of people together to discuss these things who don't agree? Now, where it does happen is on particular incidences. We heard many examples of that tonight. But to have this kind of discussion with, with a group of economists would be not easy to arrange. The one time, in fact, it happened at the University of Waterloo. I remember very well. I was asked to come and talk at a conference on rethinking economics. Well, that sounded great. And it was partly sponsored by the economics department, which was even more encouraging. So I gave my talk, and then the students who organized it said to me, "Oh, you're going to be on a panel with members of the economics department." I said, "Well, okay, when?" "Well, now." Well, that's a lot of preparation. So we sat down, and I made a few, I thought, kind of mild criticisms of mainstream economics. Well, after the discussion was over, I asked one of the participants why they deliberately misrepresented something I said. And he was so angry at me that he turned around and stormed off. Talk about not engaging. And so there we were in a supposedly discussion of rethinking economics, and we couldn't engage. And something I wanted to mention earlier as part of our problem, and it's in universities, although we've made great strides in having interdisciplinary studies, faculties like Deborah and I belong to, and here in the University of Waterloo, but they're sort of still relatively small and not influential and tolerated rather than celebrated. And the mainstream disciplines still dominate academia. And while that happens, having the conversation is the hardest part. Not how do we have it, but just having it.
Yeah. Did you want to say something?
Oh, yeah. No, and I also wanted to say, for us, actually, when you see the Atlas of Environmental Justice and it's some people might find it actually kind of demoralizing and demotivating, but we actually see these stories as really inspirational and hopeful, in the sense that, as I mentioned, the fact that communities are standing up and beginning to resist is actually the beginning of these transformative processes. And if you look at the history, if you think about environmental justice, it's actually a movement with a pretty short history, kind of in line with the civil rights movement. So communities, since not that long ago saying, yeah, we're not going to be polluted anymore. And now this movement has spread all around the world, and of course kind of, come up with all these alliances with the climate justice movement. So this map is actually, hopeful. For me, actually, it gives me hope that that communities are actively resisting, and they are, refusing to. They are saying that we want another type of development. So this space is being open to look at new, to say we don't want this top-down model of development. And that's a positive thing. So I don't see this as, I see this really as a, something for me that gives me hope and makes me actually joyful.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're absolutely right. I think, but you're hitting the nail on the head. Is that people need to see themselves as in the conversation to make it more palatable, even if it's ugly, and they see themselves in there, and they see how the long-term conversation contributes to some sort of benefit or change, fundamental shift that benefits them. You can have the uncomfortable conversations, but I just want to point out the fact that yes, it's great. I'm really happy that there's 2 Indigenous women on this panel, but where are all the other people of color that are a part of this conversation? We're getting really good in Canada of recognizing Indigenous peoples rights, and the human rights abuses of Indigenous peoples, but those abuses don't just stop at Indigenous peoples. We have taken advantage of and subjected immigrants and migrants to atrocities in our workforce and our labor industry. We have mistreated our black brothers and sisters in this country, and we have to absolutely include them in this conversation and allow them to see themselves as part of this discourse. Even if it's ugly, they need to see themselves there, because otherwise they're not going to participate, and we're going to miss another key part of the segment of the population that needs to be included. We need to get everyone to the table, absolutely, but I don't think whether or not it's ugly is going to dissuade them. I think we just need to see ourselves in these conversations, and then we can have them.
I think I'll answer that question by, because, I guess being an educator, teaching for 25 years plus, pretty well everything I teach makes people uncomfortable. So, except they're paid to be there, so they can't leave. I guess some people do. But I think what I would just say in terms of advice is just kind of stick it out, because it is going to be unsettling, because people don't know that history. They don't know these larger conversations, and so it's being able to stick it out and then begin to take responsibility for the little bit that they know. There's this thing, I go, that's kind of like my whole teaching career, making everybody uncomfortable, because you're delivering this message that people actually don't want to hear a lot of the times, or they're not ready for. And so you have to figure out how to work around having people become more comfortable and take responsibility for learning, and kind of have the confidence and commitment to stick it out and sort of get to the other side of it, and sort of see how their own thinking can be transformed. So I would say just try to stick it out, because believe me, it's really uncomfortable to be shot as a messenger every single time for 25 years. So it's sort of I'm pretty sure you can handle another lecture on injustice.
So I think it's probably time to wrap it up. I'm going to just say thank you very much to our panelists, and to the hosts of this event, and to all of you for having come this evening, and for your excellent questions. To the office worker out there, one last suggestion: connect. You've come this evening, that was really good. Connect with other people and talk about this, because that is, I find, something that really alleviates it. Thank you.
I was going to say internal sabotage.
Yeah.
You again. Oh, good. I was just throwing ideas out there, because I'm